Now that we have had a brief introduction to Vue and two-way data binding or interpolation, let's talk about some Vue directives, which can really make our lives a whole lot easier. First one I'm going to show you is called vif. vif. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But what this directive is going to do is it's only going to display an element if a condition returns true. And you write it this way: vif equals quotation marks. You write it just like ID or class or any other HTML attribute. This is vif. Now let's make a dummy data point here called is visible. And let's set it to false. Oh, sorry, no semicolon there. Now inside of vif, I'm simply going to write is visible. And this currently has a value of false. As such, this whole h1, which contains num times 50, should not appear when I reload my page. And that's exactly what's happened. It's gone. It's not there. If I inspect and look for it, then look, it hasn't even rendered at all. It's not display none. It's not visibility hidden. It's not opacity 0. It has been completely wiped from memory. That may seem like a subtle difference, but that's really important, because if you have a lot of elements which have the display none property, they'll be hidden. They'll be removed from your HTML, but they're still there in memory. They still take up load time. They still can slow down your application. This, vif, and its counterpart, which I'll show you in a moment, can really, really help trim down your application if you have a lot of changing states like this. Okay, so that's vif. If I change is visible to true and reload my page, save and reload my page, the number reappears. Let's try this a little differently now. Let me get rid of this whole h1 entirely. I'm going to get rid of this is visible property. So we're back to just message and num. And inside of the h1, which contains this greeting, I'm going to write vif equals, and inside here I'm going to exercise a little bit of logic. I'm going to create an object, and inside this object, I'm sorry, I'm not going to create an object. I'm simply going to check if num times 50 is greater than 5,000. Okay, so this should evaluate to true or false. Num is going to pull its value from our data object, and this whole statement is going to evaluate to true or false. If it is false, this h1 will hide. If it is true, this h1 will be visible. I'm going to save, reload, and it is invisible. That's because 100 times 50 is 5,000. It is not greater than 5,000. If I change this to greater than or equal to 5,000, the sentence reappears. So we have actually a lot of dynamic logic here going on here, a deceptively large amount. We have a conditional statement being evaluated to a Boolean here in our HTML. We have a Vue directive that hides or shows or displays this h1 based on whether or not this condition is true or false. And we still have this two-way data binding with this interpolation, this message property here. So there's a lot actually going on, but taking up very, very little memory, requiring very little complex JavaScript logic or scripting. But we have created a situation with multiple possible states. The value of num can change, and that can determine whether or not this message shows. And message, of course, can change and determine what is actually written to the console. And any one of these numbers could be similarly dynamic variables. Okay, so that is vIf. It also has a counterpart, vElse. So let's just write an H1 here, and I'm just going to say, it's just going to say else statement ran, like old times. I'm going to change this vIf back to num greater than 50. Num times 50 is greater than 5,000. And we're going to attach to this H1 a vElse. So num is still 100. 100 times 50 is 5,000. 5,000 is still not greater than 5,000. So this should be false, which means this statement, this whole element, should not render. And what's going to happen is the vElse element renders instead. Okay? Because this if statement returned false, this H1 with the vElse directive actually rendered in its place. That's a very important and very useful tool using Vue.js. Let's try this again and make sure that, what did I do? Let's try this again and make sure that this statement returns true. And now we should see this top H1 render instead of this bottom H1. Reload, and there we go. So only one of these will ever be visible at any given time. We're actually encoding if-else logic into our HTML. That is pretty amazing. It's one very small example of how Vue is very, very powerful. All right. And the last thing that I'll show you for right now is going to be the vbind directive. Let's create another H1. This one's saying goodbye. And I'm going to create a new data property, which is going to be called, I'm going to just call it goodbye. How about that? Well, no, goodbye styles. Goodbye styles. And this is going to be an object itself with, let's do background color, tomato, and color, white. I'll talk a little bit about why background color is in quotation marks in a second. And finally, let's do padding, 5 pixels. Ooh, right, 5 pixels. That needs to be a string. Okay, so we have this object within our data called goodbye styles. So here in my HTML, on this H1 that says goodbye, I'm going to use the vbind directive. And here, following vbind, we need to select an HTML attribute to bind to. And the attribute I'm going to bind to is style. And the value I'm going to give to style is going to be goodbye styles. And what we should see happen is the key value pairs inside this goodbye styles object should all be inserted into the style attribute of this H1. So let's reload. And I broke it. 1 second, folks. Where did I go wrong? I didn't save again. Same thing, always save. Okay, reload. Still broke it. Ah, that's right. These should all be strings. The values of these properties should all be strings. Apologize for that. There we go. Okay. And it worked perfectly. All of these 3 CSS properties and values have been inserted into the style attribute of this h1 as a result of this vbind style goodbye styles. Now, that may not seem too impressive, but consider that goodbye styles and the values of its properties can be dynamic. These properties and their values can be updated by user action, by some other function, by a set timeout function, by any other kind of logic you can think of. These values can all be rendered dynamic, which means the styling of this element or of any other element can also be easily rendered completely dynamic, which is very, very powerful. And the fact that they will all be managed by this Vue instance makes the code very, very easy to maintain and to make more sophisticated and complex. This is a very simple example. I'd encourage you to play around with it on your own, but it is important to drive home how these work, how these connections are being made. And the important thing to consider here is this vbinding, a style attribute, expects to receive an object in here. All right, so quick recap. We did vf, which will display or not display an element based on whether or not this condition returns true or false. We learned about velse, which displays the following element if this condition is false. Basically, they work exactly like if and else statements. And vbind, which allows you to bind an HTML attribute to a property in our data object. For vbind, think about it. It doesn't have to be style. We can bind classes. We can bind IDs. We can bind types. There's no limit to what we can bind to the value of a property in our data object, or no limit to the HTML attributes which we can bind to values of properties in our data object. I know this feels like a lot, but I just want to drive home that this can be an extremely powerful tool, and we will see some more examples and some more use cases of it.